Well, this is Charles Scoble, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday here on June the 21st, 2024. 21st, it is Summer Solstice Day. So all kinds of excitement, of course, around this day because we're going to start seeing days get shorter, but more importantly, we're going to be pushing flowers in soybeans. So we're going to talk about that as well as that whole crop progress here in Michigan, share some agronomy calls that I'm getting with you, and I have a special guest, Dr. Marty Chilvers, because we're getting all kinds of questions about tar spot being found in northern Indiana, right at the doorstep here of Michigan, and kind of give us some idea of putting that into perspective. So, first of all, crop progress. The corn planted on the 1st of May is accumulated about 748 heat units. So, what does that mean? Well, we're at about V8 growth stage, and now we're putting the length on those ears. And so getting rows long compared to the rows around we were getting at V5, we are ahead of normal. And we're certainly having some heat out there we're going to talk about as well. But in the soybeans, we had a chance to walk some April planted soybeans, and I'm actually finding lots of flowers out there. And truly, that is the goal as we look at how we increase yields on soybeans all the time. That the advantage of that early planted soybean is getting flowers to start earlier, before that summer solstice time period. So the more flowers, the more yield. And certainly we got a lot of things to go between now and harvest to protect those flowers and the yield. But we'll continue to talk about that in the weeks to come. Let's talk about that heat and rain, though, lately. Boy, temperatures in the 90s. We are putting stress on these crops. If you think about the formula for creating GDUs, rather, growing degree day units out there, that's all about a low of 50 and a high of 86. So when we're in the 90s, we're not counting those extra heat units, and sometimes they even count against us. But boy, the good news for most of us is we have had some rain. So I haven't seen any rolled corn yet. So this rain has been a nice buffer for that heat. I actually had 2.7 inches at my place, northeast of Langsburg. Heard of some areas of 4+ inches as well. So the downside of that rain is seeing some ponding. So we're thinking loss of nitrogen in some of those areas, whether that is being from leaching down or some denitrification up in there. And then, of course, the question is those areas underwater, how long can those plants survive? And, if it was cool and wet, they could survive a little bit longer. But when it's hot and wet like that, and those plants are trying to respire, they just don't have much of a chance for the amount of time they're going to be underwater there, a day or two, and they're not in good shape at that point. So we're going to evaluate these farm by farm. But if we had some of those heavy rains and we think we lost some of that nitrogen, we don't want to allow that crop to run out of nitrogen by the end of the year. So adding more may certainly play in that if and when we can still get over that crop. But as far as agronomic calls this week, lots of deer and woodchuck damage showing up, especially in those soybeans there. And I don't think I need to tell you what we need to do to keep those under control. But another thing that's more interesting is rapid growth syndrome. Now, we've got the perfect storm for that. And if you remember what that is, you'll look across that cornfield and you'll see just scattered yellow plants throughout the field. And you walk out there, those yellow plants, and you can see that, boy, probably a couple days before that, they were all buggy whipped and wrapped up tight because they're just growing so fast with this heat and moisture out there. And then once they relax a little and open up those whorls, they were pretty tight. They didn't collect any chlorophyll, and so they're bright yellow. But give them a few days to collect some more sunlight there, more chlorophyll built in there, and they green right back up. And really, the good news is no yield loss from those. Also, kind of interesting, finding lightning bugs out there. And that, to me, is always that indicator that our corn rootworms are starting to hatch. And, granted, the rootworm and the lightning bug, they're not related, but they do tend to share a little bit of a path for following the amount of heat units they've had for their development. And by the time they're flying out there for lightning bugs, underground, we're hatching rootworm. They're starting to feed. And so in a couple weeks, we can probably start to evaluate some of those roots and float some rootworms and take a look and see what our real pressure was this year. So finally today, we're going to jump into a little conversation with Dr. Marty Chilvers and talk about that tar spot found in northern Indiana. So Dr. Chilvers, good morning and welcome.
Hi, Charles. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, as I think about tar spot in this world, I think of Dr. Marty Chilvers. You've had a chance to just be a true expert for the field, for Michigan, and truly, I think, across the United States. So I really appreciate you joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
So, couple three questions here. I was hoping you might cover for our listeners. The first of which is, with the recent spotting of tar spot just over the border, Indiana, it's just so early in the year. Should my listeners be concerned?
Yeah, I think this is one of those years where things are, off to a early start for tar spot, just like we saw back in 2018 and 2021 with wet seasons. So yeah, I am concerned, and I think if we spend a bit of time looking through, perhaps variety trials is a really good spot to go and scout. We may very well find tar spot in those here in Michigan.
Well, and that's really interesting too, because it's one of in my mind, the first things to look at is that genetic tolerance, and we've seen over the years how huge of a difference there is from one hybrid to the next on tolerances. And I know at least with our own, we can go on the web and look up any hybrid and give a rating on there and help to think about how we're going to manage those hybrids.
Yes, I completely agree, Charles. That's really where we need to start. So if we do have significant issues this year, go back and look at the ratings in your seed catalogs or talk to your seed dealer about that to, plan perhaps some better hybrids going forward.
If we didn't make that right choice, or, if we do choose to spray a fungicide for tar spot this year, the big question now is when is the best time to spray? Because,
Right.
especially with this possible early infection out there.
It's the $1 million question, right? So it depends on a few factors. It depends on, obviously planting date, growth stage, the amount of disease pressure, all those things factor into when we should be spraying. And then we sort of want to think about, how many fungicide applications can we actually make that sort of makes sense. So if we are only going to plan on a single fungicide application and use that to get us through the season, a single fungicide application we've generally seen has got to be on at very late vegetative stages, typically at tassel through to about the R3 growth stage. Most years, a single well-timed application in that window provides sort of the best return on investment. There are certainly some exceptions to that where, a second fungicide application can be warranted, but, they tend to be fewer in nature. It's always it's an issue though of, being aware of where your crop is at, scouting and really keeping an eye on where things are at to make that application. And we do have some risk prediction tools. We have Tar Spotter and Field Profit are a couple of tools that you can look at to help look at when we're at high risk for a tar spot. But generally, if we're looking about the first application, we generally believe, waiting until at least the V10 growth stage. We would see very little benefit, I would think, from a V5, V6 fungicide application for tar spot management. We really want to think about protecting those leaves that contribute significantly to yield, which are, going to come out later, a little bit later in the season. So there's some things that we typically want to think about when to make that fungicide application.
Oh, so what I'm hearing you say is keep your powder dry right now, right?
Yes, yes, I would. I would. I mean, if you found a few spots in the field, good that you're aware of it, but I wouldn't freak out, pull the trigger now, and then have it. You're going to have to come back if we continue to have leaf wetness events. You're not going to eliminate disease from a field. I think the other thing we want to really be aware of is sort of managing expectations from fungicides. So they're great at suppressing disease. They will not, completely eliminate disease. And they'll give us some level of protection for, 2 to 3 weeks before they start to sort of, wane in efficacy.
Well, and I think too, when we get those multiple modes of action out there and those fungicides out there, the ones that tend to give us a little bigger window of protection, it seems.
Absolutely. And I think that's some of the work that the universities have found too, that generally speaking, the multiple fungicide classes in a premixed product do a better job than a single mode of action. And the other thing that we are very concerned about with this disease is the development of fungicide resistance in the pathogen. So if we're
Mhm.
using a single mode of action,
Yep.
we're applying a lot more pressure and the risk for fungicide resistance is greater. So the premixed products are a good deal for that.
I couldn't agree more, And the last question here, I think, it's been really hot and really humid this week.
Hmm.
It's got me thinking, how do you think this is going to affect the spread of tar spot development in Michigan?
I mean, I don't think the heat is going to shut it down. I did call my colleague in Georgia back in 2021, asking him, why he's finding so much because early on we sort of assumed it was a cooler season disease, but now I think we've got plenty of evidence that it can handle warm temperatures. And there's been findings in Kansas and Missouri already. I think that was a couple of weeks ago now. So it's out and about, and it's not going to really be slowed down by the warm temperatures. The thing that will slow it down is dryness. So the thing that it's going to need is leaf wetness events, essentially. So be that through rainfall or dew periods at night, or if we're irrigating, excessive irrigation applications. So they're the things that sort of think about in terms of risk factors for disease spread. And we know it takes probably around about 2 to 3 weeks from when a spore lands on the plant to it becoming infected and then being able to release spores again. So that's a really critical piece.
Yeah, boy, I'm glad you mentioned the irrigation too, because boy, we've seen that
Hmm.
some of the worst case scenarios, and you've seen the photos as well that
Hmm.
from the air when you find those
Yes.
drier corners that don't have tar spot and the irrigated areas that do. So I'm watching those areas especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't give up on irrigation. We still need to irrigate. And so some of the lessons there have been that if we irrigate, we want to put on as fewer passes of the pivot as possible, within reason in terms of soil moisture and how much water you can put down before you have, runoff. But you're just trying to be aware of your pivot, uniformity for irrigation, and then minimizing the passes of that pivot. But, we've seen that, yeah, absolutely, irrigation will drive disease. But if the year turns dry, we're going to need that water as well for grain development. So don't give up on the irrigation. It's still a very important tool.
Yeah, 100% agree. And just manage it a little differently. So,
Hmm.
hey, Dr. Chilvers, really appreciate your time today. I know you're going to be on top of this throughout the season and probably even have you back on maybe later on as we watch this develop. So, again, really appreciate your time today. And folks, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Agronomy in Action Focus Friday. Have a great weekend.